sure. Okay, cool. That's good. Yeah. Awesome.
Well, maybe I was at it later. Must have been very exciting.
Much of it, I think the last panel that I was in. For the introduction.
Before this, thanks very much.
Yeah, just be in order. Yeah, I like that, especially since this is my water glass. Hi, everyone, and welcome. We're going to get started in just a few minutes, but I want to ask you, please, if you're seated on the edges, if you could try to move towards the center. We may have some students who'll be joining after their classes, and we don't want them to disturb you as they're trying to find a seat. So if you could just slide in, that'd be great. And we're going to start in just a few minutes here. Thank you so much for coming.
I'm excited to.
I'm not putting it down. I just have to put something.
You mean in the stress in the moment?
Not even
And the time. Well, you won't.
Yeah,
What
thank
you
you.
do remember the exceeding value to everybody who hears it.
People are doing some great stuff here. Hi. Thank you. What he's done.
Yeah.
You know one of them, right?
A little bit.
IOM.
From, actually, it turns out from the internet.
That seems like a long time ago.
Can't go anywhere. Turn this on. Yeah, I thought I'd shut it off for now.
set it here if you want. Hello and welcome. I'm so glad to see everyone here today. Welcome. I want to ask if you're seated on the edge, if you want to squeeze in a little bit. We're expecting more students to arrive as their classes get out, and so that they don't disturb you. If you want to, move in a little bit, get to know your neighbors, that would be so great. So welcome. My name is Trish Komen, and I am a researcher here at the University of Michigan School of Public Health, Environmental Health Sciences Department. And I'm also proud to be part of the College of Engineering Multidisciplinary Design program. And I'm so delighted to have so many people here today in Ann Arbor, and those who are joining us on our live streaming option as well. We will be recording today. So wanted to let you know that, and we'll have plenty of time for discussion with our esteemed panel. So welcome. I'm very grateful to our sponsors, the National Institute for Environmental Health Sciences. They have funded our Michigan Life Stage Environmental Exposure and Disease Center, and Rita Locke-Caruso, our PI, is here in the audience today. Also, the Environmental Health Sciences Department at the School of Public Health and the School for Environment and Sustainability are also co-sponsoring our event. Having programs like today's event helps scientists, faculty, staff, students, and the community stay current on the latest thinking on key challenges that we face, with opportunities to interact with leading scientists and thinkers like today's panel. This is our third in a series over many years, and we're delighted to be presenting today about climate change and health, what the science says and what you can do. And this is such an important event and such an important topic. Climate change is at a key juncture right now, and our climate is our life support. And so it touches so many aspects of our everyday lives, and certainly touches a lot of people's lives related to health. So we're delighted to have a panel to talk about some key reports coming out, and to talk not only about the issues related to climate change, but also solutions. So my background, having worked at the US EPA for many years before coming to the University of Michigan, I'm extremely optimistic that we can solve this challenge. We've solved air pollution challenges in the past that have felt very daunting at the beginning. And we know we can do a lot together on this. So it's important to have these kinds of discussions and forums to be able to have a chance to figure out what we're going to do together to move forward with equitable solutions and sustainable solutions for everyone. So I'm delighted to be here today. So I want to introduce our panelists, and they will speak one at a time, and then we will have a chance for questions at the end of all the three remarks. So I'm so happy to present that we have Dean Du Bois Bowman, as well as Dr. John Balthus with NIEHS, and Dr. Kim Knowlton from NRDC and Columbia University. Our dean will be providing welcoming remarks, so I'd like to introduce him. This past fall, Dean Du Bois Bowman became the dean of the University of Michigan School of Public Health, and we are delighted to welcome him home to Michigan. Before becoming our dean, he served as the chair and professor in biostatistics at Columbia University. His research focuses on ways to improve people's mental health, mental health, and to treat neurological disorders such as Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, and depression. A renowned expert in the statistical analysis of brain imaging data, Dean Bowman has a particular and personal interest in studying Parkinson's disease. As a principal investigator, Dean Bowman has received 7 NIH grants and has been the co-investigator on an even greater number of sponsored grants, and has been an integral collaborator on international research projects led by the Michael J. Fox Foundation. Our dean has served on advisory boards and of the National Institutes of Health programs that target underrepresented minority undergraduate students at historically Black colleges and universities, and he has led NIH diversity pipeline training programs at Columbia University. The dean grew up here in Ann Arbor and he earned a bachelor's in science in mathematics from Morehouse College and earned his master's degree in biostatistics at the University of Michigan and holds a doctorate in biostatistics from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. So please join me in welcoming Dean Bowman. And would you like to sit over here so we can see?
Thank you for the very gracious introduction. It is an immense pleasure to be here with you, here at the University of Michigan, an institution with the history of bringing together diverse strengths to confront very complex problems. Our university's history tells us that the issue of climate change and health has been at the forefront of our concern for over a half century. In 1970, a group of University of Michigan students started a historic movement that would culminate in a teach-in on the environment. Although Michigan's teach-in was not the first Earth Day, the New York Times said about the teach-in that it had been, and I quote, "by any reckoning, one of the most extraordinary happenings ever to hit the great American heartland. 4 solid days of soul-searching by thousands of people, young and old, about ecological exigencies confronting the human race." During this time, Michigan's interdisciplinary strength was on full display. There were at least 125 events across campus, including things like the law school hosting authorities in the emerging area of environmental law, the physics department putting on computer simulations modeling urban expansion. There was a symposium on pesticides, a philosophical workshop on the bridge between ideals and action, a panel discussion on the root causes of environmental crises, big rallies and dozens of small workshops all over campus, and on the final day, environmentalists led a walk along the Huron River locally here in Ann Arbor. So in just over a year, on April 22nd, 2020, we will celebrate the 50th anniversary of Earth Day and its roots that began here as a teach-in in Ann Arbor. This moment in time will serve as a reminder to rededicate ourselves to this really grand challenge. It is because of the immense capacity of our expertise paired with our relentless passion that I remain hopeful that we can have a positive impact on climate change and human health. Our core purpose at the School of Public Health is to pursue a healthier, more equitable world for all through education, research, and action. Our 6 departments play a critical role in increasing our understanding and mitigating the effects of climate change on health, as well as on educating and helping people lead healthier lives. The challenges and barriers to effective management of climate change on public health are no longer purely environmental, in fact, no longer purely even scientific. They're ethical, social, political, and economic. Let me share a little about Michigan public health activities today, working alongside policymakers, community members, and industry leaders. First, in terms of education, our EHS graduate students learn the skills that they need to be leaders for climate solutions. Our undergraduate and new online MPH programs help to expand access to much needed public health training. For 10 years, we've collaborated with the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services to sponsor student internships and engage in activities related to the Center for Disease Control funded Climate Ready States and Cities program. In research and community engagement, our faculty are leaders in transforming research into policy and advocating for health equality. Our faculty emphasize community-engaged research approaches with several Detroit community partners, which includes things like evaluating how air pollution, extreme heat, extreme precipitation may impact health, especially among already vulnerable communities. and how enhancing energy efficiency and improving housing quality and public preparedness may reduce impacts on health. We focus on prevention by partnering to design healthy cities together with the Taubman School of Architecture and Urban Planning. And finally, and perhaps the most important part, we live our ideals daily. Last year, or in fact this year, our School of Public Health building in Washington Heights was recognized as the first place winner in the annual Michigan Energy Summit by reducing energy consumption by 34% over the previous year. Faculty, staff, and students have a commitment to the solid waste reduction programs within our school, and each year our nutrition students plant, tend, and distribute vegetables and herbs from our community-run garden. So these are just a few examples of the activities that I see each day in the School of Public Health. Many of you are also aware more broadly that this month, the University of Michigan president, Mark Schlissel, announced a goal of carbon neutrality and appointed a campus-wide commission. In addition to the commission, the university hopes to gather ideas from the greater community, and I hope that you'll consider participating. So just as in 1970, it will take everyone's best efforts to create meaningful change. I thank you for your time. I'm excited about today's forum and look forward to learning more from our renowned speakers. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to introduce our next speaker. Dr. John Balthus is at the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. He serves as the Senior Advisor to the Director of Public Health Issues. He also leads the NIEHS efforts on climate change and human health. And in this capacity, he serves as the Health and Human Services Principal to the U.S. Global Change Research Program, for which he co-chairs the interagency cross-cutting group on climate change and human health. Dr. Balthus's background combines training and expertise in clinical medicine with expertise in epidemiology, toxicology, and risk sciences. He's authored studies and lectures on global climate change and health, transportation-related air pollution, the toxic effect of chemicals, and regulatory and other approaches to protecting susceptible populations. Before joining NIEHS, Dr. Balthus was the chief health scientist for a non-governmental organization, Environmental Defense Fund. He served on the faculty of George Washington University, and he maintains an adjunct faculty appointment at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. He received his bachelor's degree in biochemistry from Harvard University and his medical degree, MD, from the University of Pennsylvania, and his MPH from Johns Hopkins School of Public Health. In addition to all of these great credentials, John is a wonderful colleague at the American Association of Public Health, and I'm delighted that you're able to join us here in Michigan. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Balthus.
Thank you so much, Trish. Thank you for organizing this day, and Meredith for making everything work. And thank you to our hosts, the Schools of Public Health and the School of Environment and Sustainability. It's really a great pleasure to be here. And it really is an exciting kind of auspicious time to be having a forum, a summit on this topic. Thank you for choosing climate change at this time, as we're looking back 50 years to the origins of Earth Day on this campus, and what Du Bois was just mentioning, Dean Bowman was just mentioning about the commitment of this school to look forward and to go towards carbon neutrality and to create this Climate Change Commission. So really an auspicious time, and I'm extremely happy to be able to talk to you today. Just very briefly, for those of you not familiar with the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, we are the only part of the National Institutes of Health, so we are a big biomedical research institution. We're the only part that's not in Maryland. Our institute's actually in North Carolina. I work in Maryland, but that's because they don't want me down there in North Carolina for some reason. I stay up in the Washington area. This is a day to talk about solutions, and I think that our institute is unique among the institutes and centers of the National Institutes of Health, because we really have some very solution-focused research that is other than diagnosing and treating illness, and have some very unique features like a Superfund research program that is just focused on solving environmental problems. So I really think that I speak on behalf of an institute that is not just about understanding and discovering problems, but actually solving them in my comments today. I'm going to be offering up at 4 o'clock today a bit of a sandwich. The meat of the sandwich, what I want to focus on is the content of the report that was released shortly after Thanksgiving this year, the 4th National Climate Assessment, Volume 2 on Impacts from the Global Change Research Program. And I'm going to talk to you about it from a health lens, and I'll explain that in a little bit more detail, but even more specifically in how health information is being applied to solutions to climate change, and really interpreting what is in the National Climate Assessment through that lens for the short time that I have to tell you about it today. That's the meat. On either side, I'm going to have a piece of bread that's going to be the context of this report, and then the second piece of bread is going to be maybe some personal observations on the health role in the solution space. So for the first piece of bread, this report actually had some really good company. Ooh, all right, a little, not quite as well formatted as the original. When it came out. So this fall was actually remarkable, not just because the United States released a very strong and robust national climate assessment, but it came out shortly after the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released a report, the 1.5 degree report, comparing the impacts of 1.5 degrees versus 2 degrees, and also kind of a pair for the United States. There was the Lancet Countdown 2018 report that came out this fall, as well as a US policy brief. So I think that anybody looking at this topic really needs to look at what all of these are telling us together. And, you know, I hate to start off with gloom and doom, but what they tell us is that we need to get moving. I think that what the reports of this fall tell us in sum is that the consequences of continued inaction are so high that we have no choice but to be moving forward urgently. And so, you know, for example, the 1.5 degree report talked about the impacts on coral reefs at 2 degrees versus 1.5 degrees, and the fact that about 99% of coral reefs are lost at 2 degrees, 90%, that's the good news, at 1.5 degrees. The damage to fisheries is 50% greater at 2 degrees than 1.5 degrees. And when we consider that 2 degrees is certainly not the limit or the cap on how much warming could occur, that just gives us that much more urgency. The quotes about this were pretty strong. This was the largest clarion bell from the science community, and hope that it mobilizes people and dents the mood of complacency. So that's what we're doing today, is denting the mood of complacency. And the Lancet report, there was an interesting quote. This is from an editorial that accompanied the Lancet report. It said, "The Lancet Countdown on Health and Climate Change reports on the facts and data." So we're basing this in science, we're basing this in evidence, we're basing this in both surveillance data, but also a growing body of ever increasingly robust research. The bad news, although much of the damage already caused to our planet may be irreversible, it is still within reach to alter the course of the next generation's inheritance. Hard to think of something more important to mobilize ourselves about. And using health to humanize the narrative will help realize that goal. And I thought humanize was an interesting word to use. The Lancet report actually does humanize this. It really puts the kind of lens that we think about in public health to think about populations, where climate scientists tend to think about the planet and surface. So for example, the Lancet Countdown doesn't just track the average change in temperature over the whole surface of the globe, which it's important to know that, but from a health standpoint, we want to know where the people are. And so they track a population-weighted global average temperature, and in fact demonstrated that the summertime peak average temperature since the 1988 to 2008 timeframe had gone up about 0.8 degrees Celsius compared to 0.3 degrees if you just looked at the global average. So that's kind of interesting humanization of the climate story. They also looked at labor productivity and showed that the loss of labor hours from high summertime temperatures between 2000 and 2017 had gone up from 62 billion to 153 billion hours a year. So that's a human face. Labor productivity loss means lower economic productivity. It also means lower wages. It means more illness, et cetera. But there's more to what we're going to be talking about than just putting a human face or humanizing it. Health is such an important sector that there's a very important economic role, to put it in dollars, to talk about the health sector role, and that's some of what we'll be talking about. So just very briefly, the Fourth National Climate Assessment is a congressionally mandated report. It needs to come out every 4 years. We just accomplished that for the first time in the 30-year history of the Global Change Research Program, so we're proud of that. Just a quick word, I'm using now slides from the Global Change Research Program that have a certain template. There's a little bit of code up in that cube up on the top, just so that I'm being transparent. If there's a number up there, that's an official Global Change Research Program slide that refers to a specific chapter. If there's an H, that's a slide that I made. H stands for health, where I'm just extracting health information and making my own slides, and if it's blank, because it's neither. So we talked about the messages that came from the 1.5 degree report and the Lancet Countdown. These are the top line messages that came out with the National Climate Assessment. And you know, this is a US report. It cast a pretty strong tone of urgency and a need for action as well. Earth climate is changing faster than any point in modern civilization. These changes are the result of human activities, the evidence of which is overwhelming and continues to strengthen. In that last bullet point, that neither global efforts to mitigate the causes of climate change nor regional efforts to adapt to the impacts currently approach the scales needed to avoid substantial damages to the economy, environment, and health. And called out there right at the top line message, and well-being over the coming decades. So a lot of what we have to talk about is not that we have to figure out what to do, it's we have to figure out how to scale it to get it to the level necessary to avert the damage that we're trying to do. So if we're thinking about solutions, just a quick word, what kind of solutions are we talking about? What do solutions look like? And why is health a part of the discussion of solutions outside of just thinking about health protection and public health? So one category of solutions is primary mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions through changes in the use of energy sources. Straight and simple. This could be rooftop solar, and these are images that I borrowed from Drawdown. That, you know, I think that that image is very important to me because it reminds us that one thing that health brings to solution spaces and issues like energy policy, decarbonization of our energy sources, that these have to be done with an eye to equity and to the people who are affected by these decisions, whether we're talking about the jobs that are related to changes in energy sources and energy industry, or we're talking about the benefits that accrue from reducing the combustion of fossil fuels and the reduction in air pollution, that all of these solutions need to be not just effective, but also equitable. I'm not sure about the equity of swimmers around offshore wind, but the top picture was my reminder to speak about equity. And of course, equity is not just within the confines of one nation, but it's international equity as well. The second set of solutions, so that's a pure mitigation. That's just reducing greenhouse gases. The second set of solutions are those solutions that are a little more complex. There are a lot of places in the solution space that may combine mitigation and adaptation. And some of the changes that we make in our built environment, reflective or green roofs, changes in urban design and wastewater management, et cetera, may be adaptive because we may be dealing with hotter temperatures, we may be dealing with more extreme precipitation. They also may be reducing greenhouse gas emissions. If you cool a building, it's going to use less energy to heat it. So if its energy source is producing greenhouse gases, you cool the building, you're mitigating climate change at the same time. So some of these are kind of mixed adaptation and solution, and again, there's an important need to understand either the health benefits or the potential disbenefits. Some changes in our ecosystems could put people at more risk of certain kinds of diseases, vector-borne diseases, pest-borne diseases. So we have to be mindful of the health implications of those solutions. And then lastly, you can't see this, we'll come back to this. This is just the symbol from the World Health Organization about health system resilience. So I'm dividing for my purposes today to talk about health aspects of greenhouse gas reductions, health aspects of adaptation or combined adaptation and mitigation solutions, and then the role of the health sector. And the health sector, part of that's adaptation and more resilient health systems and smarter physicians and nurses and health professionals understanding the impacts. Part of it's also reducing the greenhouse gases from the health sector itself and the need for health sector leadership in mobilizing people to act across all the different aspects of climate change and its impacts. So that's our solution space. Okay, looks like my dots may not have all come out. So one of the things that I want to, in the short time that I have, I cannot tell you about all of the places where health is mentioned in the National Climate Assessment Report. It is very extensive. My role as the principal was actually to both ensure that the chapters that needed the expertise could find the expertise, but also that the messages were consistent. It was a hard job because we had 2 different chapters that were really focused on health. We split out air quality, and the air quality chapter really has a health focus. I'll come back to that in a second. We have 7 of the sectoral chapters that actually had either key messages or key boxes talking about health. And then in terms of the regional chapters, all 10 had significant health content. So short point, a lot of health as a humanizing, as an important feature of climate change, not just in terms of straight health impacts, but how does health relate to, to the urban setting, to urban planning, complex systems, food systems, et cetera. So I can't go over it all in the time I have. Please take a look at it. In terms of the air quality chapter, there are 4 key messages. You'll see that the first 3 are really about the impacts from air quality on human health associated with climate change. It talks about things like ozone changes, changes in particulate matter. It talks about the increase in risk of wildfires and how wildfire impacts health. It talks about changes in the phenology of plants and changes in pollen production, both amounts of pollen and even the chemical nature of pollen. And then key message 4 is explicitly talking about the co-benefits or the benefits that accrue from reduction in combustion of fossil fuels that may be done to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So a straight solution intersection between health and solutions to climate change. And because these assessments are all 8 pages and very condensed, the language is not detailed in this climate assessment, but there's lots of really good references. So for all the academics, you got to just go to the footnotes. But there's the key message. Many emission sources also emit air pollutants, so controlling those emission sources would have this combined effect of mitigating climate change with immediate benefits for air quality and health. Just a couple more examples. So this would be an example in that combined mitigation adaptation space. This is from the urban chapter, and it's looking at how adaptation strategies, which are in fact many of them combined adaptation and mitigation. You see solar panels and reflective buildings, have many different stakeholders. They have many different impacts. They highlight the health impacts in this chapter. Also highlights the need to have to be looking at where people are most vulnerable, to be looking at issues of equity and justice at the same time we're making these interventions. So it's called out there. And this is just another example that they were using, looking at the Greenway response to flooding. We've seen this in a lot of cities in the United States, using ecosystem services to help reduce the impacts of extreme precipitation, and pointing out that it's really great when it floods, but it's also really great when it's sunny, because everybody can get out and have a nice corridor for exercising and meet the physical activity goals of public health, which are so critical and so hard to meet. So again, an issue of combined benefits. All right, so I said I was giving you a sandwich. It's a triple decker. This is just another piece of bread that a very thin piece that I'm putting in the middle, because when I talk about health in the fourth National Climate Assessment, for those of you interested in the topic, if you're not aware, you need to be aware of the report that came out in 2016, which was a whole 350-page special report on the human health impacts of climate change. There's the URL for it. This is the place where we really got to explain things in greater detail and talk a little bit more nuanced. But what's important for today is that this was not so much a solutions report. This was really an impacts report. It did not address adaptation or mitigation, did not really get into co-benefits, didn't really talk about the role of the health sector. So a fabulous report, the most developed report on climate and health that we've had, but it's not addressing this intersection as much of the solution space. So let me just summarize what is in the health chapter. This is actually a diagram that was originally put in the 2016 report. It's a lot to read. The reason, what I want you to feature, to kind of hone in on, it's trying to show the fact that the exposure pathways by which climate impacts health, so those are things like high temperatures and storms and air pollution and vector-borne diseases, food-borne diseases, mental health impacts, that those all take place in a social and an environmental context. And that climate change impacts that context as well, right? If flooding is a risk of creating vector-borne diseases and we have changes in precipitation patterns, then we have to be thinking outside of the health sector and into those other sectors that impact on environmental drivers, whether that's our forest management for the wildfires, whether that's our food system management, whether that's our water management. So that's the left side. Then the right side emphasizes that all of these contexts take place in a social political environment. And we have to think about the institutions, we have to think about vulnerable populations, we have to think about solutions that are not just focused on climate change, but are focused on real communities and real people, and think in an integrated fashion about those kinds of solutions. So again, it opens up, I show this because I think it opens up the solution space. And in a university, we have to be thinking about how do we integrate the social sciences with the environmental engineers? How do we integrate energy policy people with public health people? This is a diagram. Again, just I know I'm going to run out of time, so I don't want to go through it in detail, but it shows 4 examples of populations who are at higher risk. One of the things we did in the 2016 report, we had, I think, 12 or 13 different categories of populations who may be vulnerable. We really expanded that. We didn't have the space here, so this is just identifying the populations and identifying the solutions that are specific to those populations and settings. The third key message, the third section of the fourth National Climate Assessment Health Chapter report focused in on solutions. So this is the first climate assessment that actually reviewed the literature that evaluates interventions. This is very new. The solution space is pretty new in climate and health. It relied heavily on a very important CDC technical evaluation through the BRACE program that really looked at the evidence base for a lot of different specific interventions. So this was a start at actually identifying interventions and then also looking at the role of the health sector in both adaptation and mitigation. And then lastly, the fourth key message was looking at the economic impacts and saying that reducing emissions results in high economic and health benefits, looking just at the avoided impacts. This didn't even look so much at the ancillary benefits of what happens to air pollution if you reduce combustion. This was just looking at what happens if it doesn't get as warm, if precipitation doesn't change as much. And it translated these impacts into dollars, which is really important in the solution space, right? We have to be making a cost-benefit information available to decision makers to highlight the fact that inaction has costs, is the primary point here, and that there are different costs and different benefits to different options, and there's a lot of work needed to spell this out. So this was just looking at avoided impacts and the economic costs from extreme heat and cold, lost labor productivity just in the US, and they were able to also quantify this for West Nile virus neuroinvasive disease. I want to just make a comment that all of this information that's kind of cutting edge on economic costs, on adaptation and interventions, this is a relatively under-researched and new field, and a lot of this is the start of the literature. There is a need to really back this up and continue this kind of work. I don't want to take credit for this. This is actually the work of a lot of people. I didn't have, I get to talk about it, but these are the people who actually did the work. And I want to call out, well, the team that's here. These are the health experts who were part of the regional team, some that were pulled in. And then I just also want to acknowledge that we had a technical contributor, and our prime USGCRP coordinator is here in the audience, Ashley Bianiak-Tabasco, an alum of this school. So it's not, you know, we're a team here that we get to talk about all this. All right, in my remaining few minutes, I just want to give the last piece of bread. So this is just some personal reflections on what does the solution space look like for the health sector. You can read this now. I don't have time to go over it in detail, but this is the WHO's effort to frame all of the different elements of health resilience. And what's important, it's not just having doctors know how to recognize Lyme disease up in Canada. It's not just coming up with you know, vaccines that don't need refrigeration. It's the funding, the governance of the structures. It's the whole supply chain, the hardening of the facilities. It's doing vulnerability assessments, identifying vulnerable populations, putting in place protective systems to protect the most vulnerable populations. I like to split this into two different ways of thinking for health sector resilience. The first is there's a lot of things that we do in public health that are really relevant to climate change. And what is important is that we infuse climate thinking into those activities. So we're not just thinking about how do we deal with past situations, but we think about how is the future going to change in a way that impacts our goals in these different areas. So one is just the very simple and yet incredibly complex issue of reducing health disparities and providing health services to the most disadvantaged. This is both an issue within the United States and globally. If you look at the IPCC reports, they say the first thing that needs to happen for adaptation is poverty eradication. We already deal with migrant and refugee issues in this country from hurricanes. We know that the extremes are going to increase that displacement. We need to be thinking in the future in terms of the need for capacity and places for these. We're already dealing with tornadoes and hurricanes in this country, but we need to be thinking about where they're going to occur, how strong they're going to be. So putting climate thinking into these kinds of topics. And then the second category is looking at those things that are a little more specific to climate change that we wouldn't be doing otherwise, where we need to bring in the climate scientists, the meteorologists, to help with our decisions in public health and healthcare. So this is doing the vulnerability assessments, doing the mapping exercises, figuring out where are the populations, again, who are most vulnerable, creating early warning systems, whether that's for heat, air pollution, wildfires, or vector-borne diseases. We're making progress on this. There are success stories. I don't want to make everything doom and gloom. There is a lot of success. One of the biggest examples was the University of Texas Medical Center, which was devastated by 36 inches of rain in 2001. They put together an incredibly comprehensive storm management plan. They ended up, there are equity issues here if people are familiar with this, but they ended up using a lot of ecosystem services, creating holding ponds. Houston got 43 inches of rain with Hurricane Harvey, and the system held, and the hospital did not shut down. People did not die from evacuation. Millions and millions of dollars were saved, and the health, we're still trying to figure that out. Similarly, story of success with the British Virgin Islands. I don't have time for that. I'm just going to leave you with an idea that there are lots of resources for this. Hopefully these slides will be made available. And to conclude, I want to just hope that you see that there is a scientific basis for action, both on climate change in general, but also for dealing with health as part of the solution space. The interventions are underway. What we need to do is know how to optimize them and how to scale them up. And I'll just leave you with these words from the former director of the World Health Organization. These words are 5 years old, but they're just as true today. The evidence is overwhelming. Climate change endangers health. We have solutions, and we need to act decisively to change the trajectory. Excuse me. And with that, I'll close. Thank you very much. Look forward to the discussion.
Great, thank you so much. That was an excellent presentation. We are going to hold our questions until all three speakers have had a chance to present. So I want to now welcome Dr. Kim Knowlton. She teaches at the Columbia Mailman School of Public Health and is a senior scientist with the Natural Resources Defense Council at the Health and Environment Program in New York City. Her work focuses on issues related to health impacts of climate change, not surprising, including advocating for public health strategies to prepare for and prevent these impacts, and partnering with city and state governments to make health preparedness more of a central feature of our climate adaptation plans. She has done a lot of great research on heat and ozone-related mortality and illness, and she was among the researchers who participated in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's 2007 Fourth Assessment Report. And her project group at the NRDC recently launched an innovative web mapping tool that she'll be discussing. Dr. Knowlton received her bachelor's from Cornell University, a master's in science from the City University of New York's Hunter College, and her PhD from Columbia University. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Knowlton.
Thank you, Trish. It's such a pleasure to be here today. Thank you to you and Meredith and the organizers and Dean Bowman and all of your colleagues that I've had the pleasure of talking with already today. As you said, I spend most of my time at an environmental advocacy organization as a health scientist there, and I have an academic affiliation at a School of Public Health at Columbia University. But I'm going to talk, hopefully briefly, to you today so that we can get to the Q&A and really talking about solutions and where we go from here, since we know there's a growing foundation of science, a body of evidence that is compelling, that's quite enormous, that's getting larger, and I want to talk a little bit about the power of local science and understanding and some of the kind of the tools that I use, especially at NRDC, but they apply to all of our work to get from where we are now with science and evidence to action and solutions, and just as people, as human beings, as researchers, as people with families and concerns about where we're at now and where we're going into the future. As Dr. Balthus so eloquently laid out the evidence, climate change is threatening our health here and now. Climate change becomes very personal when we talk about health. It used to be conceived of as something happening to people somewhere else, far away, distant time. It's here and now. And I think these are some of the images from recent years that bring home to me just how immediate this experience of climate change, of extreme weather events has become. With the 5 warmest years globally happening in the last 5 years, that is pretty compelling. And of course, it starts with temperature and then flows, as Dr. Balthus mentioned, and as many of you know from your work, into a whole host of other environmental changes that affect our health, our individual health, our public health, our community health very closely. So I just want to offer my kind of reflections on these 4 dimensions of our action and elements of what we do and what we can do to get to a place that's more protective, more thriving, more equitable when it comes to climate change and environmental changes. To me, science, education, law, and people are 4 ways, 4 sort of elements of who we are and what we do to frame this growing body of evidence. And I'll start a little bit with the science. Many of us are scientists here. I'm a health scientist, and I've been looking both at work that I do with colleagues and looking at the work that you do, that we all do, that the sort of global community of scientific researchers are bringing to bear, since it's the way in which we understand our world. I also want to offer how powerful bringing the stories of local impacts are and making global climate change a local story. It works for us engaging with fellow academics, with our partners in the community who are hugely important, and just making putting a human face on these discussions. So I want to share with you the URL and part of the title page of a recent NRDC, Natural Resources Defense Council report that tries to bring together some of the scientific evidence about climate change impacts here in Michigan, and also talk about some of what's happening that I'll also point to a few of those, and surely all of you in the audience, many of you, can bring to the Q&A a lot of specifics about what is happening here. So there's the URL. If you want to learn more anytime about what NRDC does, we work in a lot of different areas. NRDC.org is a great place to start, because indeed there's a lot of actions that we're taking and that you can take too in all kinds of realms of environmental and health protection. The image is from a map that NRDC, as you mentioned, Trish, has committed itself to putting science into a map form, a public-facing and hopefully easily digestible form that generates conversation and generates other studies. This is from a heat map that we did just a couple years ago, where state by state you can look at trends, recent trends in recent years, in this case from 2007 to 2016, in the frequency of extreme heat days. Indeed, in counties in Michigan totaling 61% of Michigan's population, there were more frequent extreme heat days relative to a 1961 to 1990 baseline, telling us basically that the temperature profile of this state and many others is not remaining stable. It's warming. We understand the chemistry and physics of that relative to greenhouse gas emissions. Just to put in context for some of us who may not be clinicians, there are 4,000 heat-related emergency room visits between April and August in Michigan. That was from year 2012, but that just gives a sense of kind of the scope and scale of the numbers of health outcomes, cases, illnesses that we're talking about. There have been a lot of studies that try and capture what's happening now, and certainly a lot that look forward. I'm just highlighting one study that looks at the city of Detroit in future under either a high emissions profile, a scenario where we keep emitting carbon pollution, heat trapping pollution, at a rate that's sort of what we're doing today, without limits put in place to reduce those. Indeed, the city of Detroit could see by the 2080s a 120% increase. That's more than doubling in heat-related mortality by the 2080s. But if we go to a lower emissions carbon pollution scenario, if we put limits on our carbon pollution, we could cut that in half. We'll still have to deal with health impacts and heat-related health impacts of climate change, but it could make a big difference in terms of the scope of what we have to deal with. Another important type of whole realm of climate change and health effects that Dr. Balthus mentioned. This is taken from the 4th National Climate Assessment, but from the chapter, the regional chapter on the Midwest. And you can see from the map that Michigan is considered, for purposes of the National Climate Assessment, part of the Midwest. The top row is looking at the 2050s, the bottom row, the 2090, around 2080, 2090, and kind of taking air pollution, in this case ozone, ground level ozone air pollution, and looking to the future and projecting in those two time slices, 2050s and end of century, under a lower and higher emissions scenario, assumptions on the left that we've made limits to some degree in carbon pollution, on the right, no limits, business as usual. You can see with the increasing area of the red color and an expansion in the number of ozone-related premature deaths that are projected for the states in the Midwest region. So generally we see that indeed, if we don't move toward reduced emissions, as we go farther into the future, we will have to contend in some fashion, whether personally or clinically or with public health strategies, increased air pollution-related mortality. Of course, it's not just ground-level ozone. Wildfires and smoke from wildfires have been mentioned. Another important type of air pollution that I know there's a lot of research going on here at the university is ragweed pollen, or let's say allergenic pollen from plants. People may not think of this as a major health impact related to climate change, but indeed as carbon dioxide emissions increase and as temperatures warm among many of those plant species, in this case ragweed, which produces its pollen in the late summer into fall and is highly allergenic to a lot of people. It's more Americans are allergic to ragweed pollen than all other plants combined. It can be quite, for people with asthma, for people with allergies, the fact that it produces its pollen, ragweed, in late summer can be sort of a double whammy, an unfortunate term, but to people's health, because that's the part of the year in the summer when ground-level ozone episodes tend to be more frequent too. This is from a study by Louis Ziska and other co-authors looking at trends from 1995 to 2015, going from southern cities up through to the northern latitudes in the Midwest, showing how there's already been an expansion of the ragweed pollen production season. This could be quite relevant to people's health, not only because people will have to, those who have allergies will need to take their medications a longer time. They may plan, along with their clinicians, need to plan and strategize to begin those sooner, to continue them later. There's some concern that the increase in that season of pollen production may potentially impact the number of people who are sensitized. So it's an air pollutant that we may not think about, but there are rather direct connections to carbon dioxide emissions and to rising temperatures. And it's about a 15-day increase in the cities in that study that are closest to where we are now. I know, again, a number of you here do work looking at extreme precipitation events and the increasing frequency of those events across much of the Midwest and Michigan. The changing frequency, the changing seasonality of those extreme precipitation events has a hand in some of the harmful algal blooms, or HAB events, that are seen in the Great Lakes. It's also just the changing seasonality of temperatures as well as rainfall, getting harder to predict, increasingly disrupted because of climate change's effects. But when farmers apply agricultural chemicals and nutrients to their fields at what used to be the proper time, but the rains come early, or rain falls instead of snow, there have been occurrences of those chemicals and nutrients washing into waterways, where the Great Lakes water temperatures are frequently warmer than they have been historically, and both of those conditions feed into harmful algal blooms. The blooms can certainly affect drinking water quality, access to, provision of. They can also impact fishing and fisheries operations, and for some types of harmful algal blooms, there's respiratory effects because some of the toxins can become airborne. In much of this part of the country and other cities in the U.S., there are combined sewer overflows that try to deal with extreme rainfall events, but there can be contamination both of surface and groundwater, and we can see and have seen upticks in waterborne diseases as children, as homeowners who are investigating a flooded basement, as people dealing with the floodwaters come into contact with pathogens. So this is a regional impact too. Another one I'll mention is a number of infectious diseases, including Lyme disease, which is carried by the black-legged tick, pictured here. And there's the characteristic bullseye rash that is often, but not always, seen in cases of Lyme disease infection. These are two images adapted from a paper by Rebecca Eisen and her colleagues. On the left, in 1996, those counties that reported black-legged tick populations reported or confirmed, and on the left, you can see that there's a far greater number of counties reporting by 2015. Climate change is not by any means the only impact, the only environmental effect affecting the range, the number of counties across which these are seen. But with rising temperatures, the period of activity and of contact between people and ticks is increasing in many parts of the country, rising into or moving into higher elevations as well as more northward. So those are a few of the regional kind of climate-fueled environmental exposures that are increasingly important. It's not exhaustive, but I'll just mention that it's not just those exposures, it's people's vulnerability that's also of concern, and in some cases increasing. There's a little over 1 million people with asthma in the state of Michigan. That includes about 200,000 children. Those air pollution episodes, high air pollution episodes, or the increase of airborne allergens can be not only of concern to us all, because if you're allergic, it can really be a substantial challenge to your productivity, eyes, scratchy throat. It really diminishes productivity, but if you're someone with allergies or allergies and asthma, it can trigger an asthma attack, which is far more serious a concern. There's about 1.7 million people age 65 and older in this state now, but people 65 and older are more vulnerable to heat, to air pollution, to infectious disease outcomes. In cases of storms and flooding, they can sometimes be at more risk because of mobility issues or access to getting ways to get out of harm's way quickly. So we're concerned about the fact that we live in a country where the baby boomers are aging and we're moving into the 65 and older category at the most rapid rate in a generation. And indeed, there's urban heat island effects in some of the cities of Michigan, can increase daytime temperatures relative to surrounding rural areas 3-4 degrees, and that can further exacerbate the warming from climate change. And certainly there's outdoor workers, not only in agricultural professions, but many other outdoor workers who are kind of on the front lines of a lot of these environmental changes. So we put this forward, and again, we've had some success, quite a bit of success at NRDC, making global climate change a more local story and trying to map those environmental changes at the state level and the county level. This is from, and there's a URL from one of our map series. We now have updated maps on air pollution, on heat here, on infectious diseases, and we're building out new maps because it's useful for people to think about the health challenges that they encounter, look at the maps and see if this picture's something that hadn't been considered before, or if indeed it sort of might serve as a screening tool for local discussions and planning discussions. But there's another dimension that we found is important. John mentioned it, and that's the cost of health-related impacts of climate change and performing valuations of those costs. Usually when we talk about, and you hear about the social cost of climate change, the social cost of carbon, it's more typical that infrastructure damage, crop yield, and crop losses are kind of put into that calculation. But in 2011, we undertook a study with some economists to try and get our arms around what were events that are already happening in the US, what kind of health costs do they entail? So we looked at these 6 case study areas of events, extreme weather events, other types of events that are reasonably linked to climate change and that can be expected to increase in frequency or extent in the future. And even we were kind of surprised when we came up with this $14 billion price tag. I mean, that really expands notably the price tag that we're discussing, that we have to contend with now, that reasonably could be expected to increase in the future as we consider more than 6 types of events and the whole fabric of events that are happening annually. This gives a sense of the range not only of the types of case studies that we looked at, but also the breakout between valuation of premature deaths that were associated with these events and emergency room visits and hospitalizations that we came up with a standard method to value these. And you can see there are billions of dollars of costs that we need to be not only doing more of this kind of work so that we can increase this discussion, but we need to be building it into our thinking about what do we stand to benefit from avoiding, not only the health impacts, but costs that are being spent now. So with that, I'm going to kind of pivot a bit and go from the science piece, which I know many of you know about, and hopefully you'll have a chance to share with us some of your insights in that regard. But there's also education. We're at this great educational institution, an amazing university with so much great teaching, so much interest and expertise on climate and health going on. But it's noteworthy how internationally there's really relatively few institutions, and especially health professions institutions. As you mentioned, Trish, health professions are so powerful and important a voice in advancing this discussion. So I just wanted to mention an effort that I've been part of and have assisted a bit at the Mailman School of Public Health, which is the Global Consortium on Climate and Health Education. The School of Public Health, the School of Nursing of this fine university are members, along with 2 other institutions in Michigan. But globally, in the last couple of years, there have been 181 member institutions assembled, for which the deans have committed to expanding the climate and health teaching curriculum. The consortium and its advisory committee and its coordinating committee, who are kind of global leaders on climate and health education, we've assembled strategies or resource lists, core competencies that we propose be considered as part of the teaching. And this membership is now across 29 countries. So to us, this is an exciting initiative to build that community of practice and discussion and dialogue where people, without the benefit of being here, can learn essentially from you and vice versa about how this effort to teach and learn on climate and health is going internationally, because it's extremely important that we integrate our work into the global community of work. I'm going to mention law and the courts because, in part because of probably largest part because of my role at NRDC, which is about 1/3 attorneys, 1/3 scientists on its staff, and the other 1/3 the policy people and human resources and communications and everyone that makes a place like NRDC go. But the courts are really important, perhaps now as never before, because there's a lot of challenges to the environment and our health. I mean, beautiful, beautiful settings that nourish us both literally and figuratively are being challenged. And in the last couple of years, there have been a lot of challenges to natural places and to health. And it's important to remember that not only NRDC, but the courts, our own wisdom and our science, and our work with our partner groups and with attorneys can be quite potent in taking to court some of the people who are threatening health and the environment. It seems like in the last 2 years, about every 10 days, NRDC has brought a suit against the current administration, not only the current administration, but there are about 60 cases that that have shaped up so far, and of 8 of them that have been decided, but 2 of them have been in our favor. So we're encouraged by this, and we continue to respond as needed to some of the challenges, from wild places to clean power plans to vehicle standards to taking away protections for pollinator species. It's a whole host of, let's call it, opportunity. And we might think of all this as opportunity, the things that sometimes seem like, oh my gosh, that is the most depressing new science I've ever heard. Let us think about them as opportunity to avoid some of those impacts, to move toward a smarter, more strategic, more equitable, healthier, more sustainable future. Because really it is people, and it's our demand to move toward that future that is really going to push this boat forward. It's not going to happen as we sit back. And I know that many of you are not people who sit back. This is just highlighting a report that NRDC did back in September of 2017 that looks at tools and strategies that we have in hand right now, from energy efficiency and increasing our energy efficiency to reduce electricity demand, deeply, to moving toward more renewables like wind and solar and away from fossil fuel burning, creating jobs, using for those types of fuel needs that are perhaps the the most challenging to substitute, maybe for those we use, biofuels. But this kind of outlines a number of ways that we can get to that stated goal that's now been updated of an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. So I invite you to go to the NRDC website and look at that plan a little more. And we know that there are other plans recently proposed to move decisively into the future. And I have to give you all a thanks and a shout out and a lot of credit, because I know a number of you had a hand in the progress that Michigan has made in recent years toward reducing your CO2 emissions. There's been a 15% decrease in the 10 years between 2005 and 15. There's been a move toward more wind and solar that's helped to avert a lot of CO2 that kind of equates to reduced passenger miles in vehicles. And the state has recently really increased its incentives for energy efficiency and renewable targets. So I would love to hear from more of you in the Q&A about the specifics of what is going on and how we can all work together. But undoubtedly, not only here, everywhere, there's more to do. We can, replace coal plants that are retiring, put more demand to replacing them with energy efficiency and wind and solar instead of new natural gas plants, another fossil fuel, admittedly lower polluting, but that leap is what's being discussed now. Promoting clean transportation planning as ways to not only save dollars, but protect health, the co-benefits that you were talking about, John. And with a state plan on climate and health adaptation, and with cities like Detroit with climate adaptation plans, this is not the time to kind of step back from full implementation of those great ideas that have been put together. And, I applaud you, and, people out here applaud those plans and that planning. But whatever it can take to see those plans through to their full implementation, it couldn't be a more important time. Because partner engagement and sort of taking that people dimension and saying it's us at the university, and it's our partners in the community, and it's our partners in governance. And it's not just here, of course, it's all over the world. These are a couple of images from partnerships that I'm lucky to be a part of in India, where in the city of Ahmedabad, which is in Gujarat state in Western India, NRDC has worked on heat wave early warning systems and now air pollution early warning systems. This is from the heat wave action plans, where the city of Ahmedabad, the municipal leaders, have such a sense of ownership and have done so much to put in Gujarati and in English tips on keeping cool, on reducing heat vulnerability, on the tuk-tuks, the ways of getting around. Women march through the streets to raise awareness on climate change, on health. There's text messages, there's SMS messages. The mayor, that's the mayor of Ahmedabad, painting the roof a reflective color. So partner engagement is something international. It's something for us to continue to be creative with and about, and ask ourselves, how can we do better? Because it's really those three things, the power of science, law, and people, that's going to help us get to the health profession's voice being, central, us all seeing that climate change affects us all, and kind of spreading the word that there's no way to lose in this regard. It's not a hoax that will hurt us to follow, because a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens has changed the world. It can change the world again, and I am grateful to you for a chance to talk with you and listen to you about what you're doing to help change the world. So with that, I'll say thanks to the organizers and all of you, and I'm looking forward to a Q&A. Thank you. Thanks.
Sit down at the table. So I'm going to invite our speakers to join us at the table here. And this could be a time for those who are seated on the edges, if you want to find a seat to move on in. That'd be great. Join us? Great. All right. So we have microphones on either side, and we're looking forward to your questions.
Hi, thanks so much for having this discussion today. Appreciate it. Great job, presentation. It's difficult getting local communities to deal with climate change. Here we are in Ann Arbor, one of the most progressive cities in America, at the University of Michigan, one of the most progressive universities. And yet we're trying to get the city and the university to deal with the effects of climate change on flooding. And we have flood scientists at the U of M who've come to city meetings and warn the city and warn the university about flooding. But it's really hard to get the leadership to change their mindset. They're still building in the floodplain, still building in the floodway. The University of Michigan just bought a huge piece of property in the floodplain at Fingerly Lumber. And we're very concerned. I'm with the Allens Creek Watershed Group, and is my wife. And we're very concerned about, what is happening in Ann Arbor about flooding. We had a major flood event in Warren, Michigan, a couple years ago. $2 billion in damage. It was a 500-year rain event. Several people were killed in that flood. We've had flooding in Holland, Michigan several years ago, washed out 13 bridges. So the expense for climate change, like you talked about, is very significant. It's something that, if we don't do anything, is going to be very costly in life and health and economics. And Michigan has great potentials. We have lots of fresh water. We have lots of wind. We could be generating a lot of wind power. We could be exporting energy out of Michigan with all the wind potential we have. But I just, want to say that I'm glad you're out trying to beat the bushes, so to speak. And I think, we need to keep pushing. And I think, we can't really just sit back because our kids will have to live with the repercussions. So thanks for coming tonight. Appreciate it.
Great, thank you.
Can I ask a question on that? Here, trying not to detach that. Is there a provision in Michigan whereby the past flood history of a property must be revealed in the purchase transaction? I think it's fairly uncommon, and that might be a starting
Well, one thing that is kind of strange is we had a development that was in the floodplain. The city, the county, the state approved this development to go forward, and part of the development was not inhabitable because the insurance company said, I don't think you want to build those condos on the ground level because they're going to be very expensive to insure, and they didn't do it. They decided, so here's an insurance company that stopped the state, the county, and the city from developing in the floodplain because of insurance. And if you sell a house and you have a mortgage, you have to just talk about flood insurance with your mortgage holder. And theoretically, that's a requirement if you have a mortgage. If you don't have a mortgage, flood insurance isn't required. And that's another issue. Flood insurance is really pretty loosey-goosey, so to speak, and we really need to make sure that people are protected from flooding.
Great, thank you. I see a question over here.
Thank you all for your excellent talks today. When I hear people talking about climate change so often, they're talking about what needs to be done by 2050, what the world might look like at a certain advanced year. The IPCC says by 2030. And the question that goes through my mind is, what about 2019? Shouldn't we be doing something in 2019? There is a bill now before Congress, the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividends Act, that would put a tax on carbon, a fee, all returned to the American people. In my mind, that's the biggest thing that could be done in 2019 to start progress on climate change. Interested in the speaker's comments on that.
Great. Does anyone want to remark on that?
I'm not going to comment on legislation
Putting a price on carbon makes a lot of sense. The way that it's done is, up for discussion, but rapid action is, I think, critical. There's a piece of legislation that's proposed, so I certainly think it is worth discussion. Timing is of the essence, as you say, but I'm not a policy expert. I'm a health scientist, but you know the local conditions and opportunities.
Great, Susan.
Thank you very much for your comments today. I'm curious if any of the speakers had any further comments about the medical system's cooperation and collaboration in working on their own carbon emissions footprints. You know, are you seeing forums emerging around that or organization emerging around that question?
The health sector's been pretty slow to take action, and there are still pretty deep pockets of resistance. But there are organizations. So when the Obama administration developed a climate adaptation plan, or asked every agency to develop a climate adaptation plan, back in 2014, I was involved in the HHS adaptation plan, and partnered with an organization called Healthcare Without Harm to develop a toolkit for sustainable climate resilient healthcare facilities. That organization, Healthcare Without Harm, has a climate clean air, no, I'm sorry, it's my brain shutdown time, but they have a coalition of leading healthcare systems that includes Kaiser Permanente, includes Dignity Health, it includes, I'm sorry? No, that's the green, that's something else. So it's mobilizing some of the biggest health systems in the country. It's still kind of tip of the iceberg. Canada is mobilizing its healthcare systems. There is also a consortium of medical societies that's been formed in the United States after the UK formed a consortium of medical societies. And you know, that consortium is trying to mobilize the different medical specialties to take action. So it exists, but it's got, you know, a long way to go to really penetrate. Any other?
So this is another thing I would like to comment on, which is all of our institutions need to be thinking very deeply about where we get our energy and where our transportation services come from. And we need to be making some changes. And I'm delighted that we have a representative from US EPA, Buddy Polovic, who's here, who will have a table out front to talk about supply chain and better transportation services from a market-based perspective. So I encourage you, if you're interested in these topics, stop by their table, and there'll be some other tables outside to have further conversations. See a question?
The three reports that recently came out and a paper that kind of all supported each other that you mentioned seem to suggest things are getting bad faster than predicted. The model's worst case was maybe not the worst case. And you put up some great data from the 2016 health report and then from the 2011 Knowles et al. On cost and health implications. Do you think they were 2050 and 29, those predictions should be redone? Maybe they weren't using the worst case scenario.
The first answer is, oh yeah, of course they have to be redone. I mean, that was the very first foray into this. So, I mean, there's kind of two sides to this. One is, you know, what is our certainty about what things are going to look like in 2050, 2090? And there are always choices about, you know, how you predict, you know, what kind of trajectory we're going to follow in terms of energy. You know, I think that what we are seeing is just the very, very preliminary kinds of analyses. And what we need are, because we can't predict the future, we need to have a very full range of scenarios. You know, the 8.5, so for those of you not familiar, if you're health people, you see RCP 8.5, you see RCP 4.0, you may think that those are like radio stations or something. I mean, the RCP stands for, oh boy. I'm sorry, it is really my brain shut. Concentration pathways. These are scenarios that were created by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to depict different trajectories towards certain levels of radiative forcing in the atmosphere. Radiative forcing is where the rubber meets the road in terms of greenhouse gases reflecting infrared radiation back to the planet and warming the upper atmosphere. The RCP 8.5 has been labeled as a worst case scenario, but it's there are things above it, just as we usually predict out to 2100, but things don't stop getting worse at 2100. The trends will continue. So to get to your point, I think that there's a lot of conservatism in the scientific community, and there's a lot of conservatism that goes into international and national scale assessments. There can be an argument made that some things aren't as conservative, but having been a part of them, there are a lot of things that happen in those processes that cause people to scale back a little bit and try to come up with a consensus, which tends not to be the most extremes. And so we have seen in some cases that the trajectory of sea level rise, that the trajectory of temperature increases compared to what was predicted 15, 20 years ago is a little bit higher. So, I think the answer to that is yes, we need to redo the analyses, and we need to look at a wide range of scenarios and compare the worst to the best.
Oops. Sorry. And I'll just mention that NRDC has an update of the 2011 work underway. So we'll look in different areas at different types of health impacts. But even we have a measure of conservatism, and so it'd be interesting to, let ourselves consider what's been in recent years those worst case events. Hurricane Maria, Hurricane Harvey, a number of others come to mind. So there's always room for more work.
And I just want to make the opposite case too, that there are some things that we have to be open to things either not being as bad as predicted, accumulation of ice in the Antarctica, not always for good reasons, or the fact that if you look at the mortality, the heat-related mortality in this country associated with a given degree of heat exposure, the sensitivity of populations is actually declining. So even as the temperature is going up, the heat-related mortality is not going up as much as it would have had there not been effective adaptation. So we have to be open to all of the uncertainty in both directions. But there are certainly, we're seeing certain, there have been a lot of headlines about Greenland ice and Arctic ice, melting faster than people were saying. Cuts both ways. Yeah, thank you.
So I'm hoping that we have some students who would like to ask a question.
Hi. Oh, wow. Thanks for being here and sharing your information with us. I have a question for all three of you, and that is, as researchers with a scientific background, it's great to understand all of this science and evidence that is showing that climate change is real and caused by humans. How do you approach people who don't necessarily feel that way, who don't believe the evidence? How do you maybe change your message to reach those people? And then a question specifically for Dean Bowman, how do you get people, or do you get people, who are not specifically studying climate science and climate and environmental health to care about this issue and incorporate this very, again, severe issue into what they are studying, what they are learning, and what they are teaching?
It's an excellent question that I think we see playing out more broadly in society than any time that I can remember in the past. And I think we as scientists have to double down on what we believe provides sort of the veracity of evidence, and to not back away from that. We have to understand that and meet people where they are, that there may be skepticism. These things are, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, there are social, political, economic drivers that may shape how people feel emotional from that perspective. That, these things are frightening, but that ultimately, I think science will guide us, and that's a part of what we're here to do at the School of Public Health, is to train to be able to deliver the evidence-based information to help guide us in our decision making. So just a combination of patience, communication, and understanding and compassion to be able to reconcile these issues. But they're challenging.
That was a great answer.
Yeah. Maybe I'll find a way to weave my answer into some other question, because that's a standalone.
Yeah, that was a perfect answer. You know, I would only say that it is patently obvious that just providing evidence does not change opinions or behavior or policy. We can't abandon generating quality evidence, and I completely agree. You know, we stand behind it. We have to stand up for the integrity of our science very strongly. Um, but we also have to understand um, and have compassion for all people because, you know, there are, as you say, there are reasons behind people's reactions when you dig down and understand that, and not have the expectation that, you know, just providing what we believe as scientific evidence is always going to be convincing, and having that patience. I think that's a great answer.
Great.
Thank you.
I think we
Okay,
have
now I
time
got it.
for one more question.
Oh, shoot, okay.
Okay, so I understand it's like important to kind of, you know, think about how environmental factors relate to public health, like within our own country. But so I'm an international studies and environment double major, and so I was wondering, kind of like on a global scale, as members of the international community, how do we, like in conjunction with taking care of our own country, how do we help other countries that don't have, you know, the same resources and adequate healthcare we do? For example, like in the recent environmental performance index, there were countries like Burundi and Myanmar at the bottom of the list that had extremely low environmental protection, and as a result, you saw like high amounts of gastrointestinal diseases and infant mortality. So, how do we help those countries while still helping our own country?
Just based on my experience, you know, one person's experience working in India that I mentioned a bit, it's that question of how can, first thing that comes to mind is respect. A sense of respect and interest and openness to learning as we have, as anyone working anywhere and internationally, maybe doubly so. You learn from the setting, from a respectful view of the setting, and see the ways to help partners build capacity. But then I also think strongly, you've almost got to be committed to being there for the long run to build relationships and trust. And it usually costs or takes a lot of time, which means a lot of resources. But I think when you bring honest listening and respect and all of your skills and are in it for the long haul, you find ways to provide the best capacity building that could be, so that when you eventually have to leave, if you indeed do, things have changed and you've changed too. So I think it's just good old relationship building.
I completely agree with that. I'm going to answer from a really different perspective. What I heard in your question was, you know, the United States, from a policy and action perspective, has a set of challenges, but low-income countries especially have a much more daunting set of challenges and are in many ways the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change that are coming. And so how do we think about working within our borders, but then also working without, you know, on the outside of our borders? And you know, it's a pretty daunting time right now, but I just want to make a couple of observations. The U.S. thinks, you know, very, very differently about development and about development assistance than the rest of the world. And so, you know, we need to work, you know, as, you know, historically one of the larger polluters of the atmosphere, we need to obviously address our own actions. The rest of the world frames this kind of a question these days to a large degree in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals from a policy perspective. And I think one of the important ways to address the complicated interrelated set of challenges in countries like Myanmar and Burundi is through an SDG framework to tying the kind of assistance that's going on. If we look at, you know, if you look at what institutions like the World Bank and some of the major DFID and the other, you know, other country development assistance, the way that they're working, trying to address the problems of poverty, inadequate health care and access to health care, and sustainable development and energy sources and energy for the poor, all in a holistic framework, and informing, you know, trying to inform the the assistance and the funding of projects that can very often be kind of siloed, and to think in a more holistic way about solving problems in an SDG framework. That's just a small slice of what was a really huge and important question, but it's one way for the people who are kind of in their studies to think about a framework, at least, and an approach to addressing the multiple problems.
Great. So we are out of time for questions, but we will have time during the reception that will follow for more discussion. I want to invite our speakers to give a closing statement if you would like. If there's something you'd like to say that you hope for, or you can pass if you prefer. And Dr. Knowlton, we're going to start with you.
Stay hopeful, demand action of yourself and other people. We won't be dissuaded. That's it. So important. This is our time, the opportunity of a lifetime, and here we all are.
I mean, I'll just kind of second, you're all in this room now. This institution is at a very critical moment, and Dr. Junkard, said, why are we thinking 2030? We should be thinking 2019. We should be thinking, February 26th or maybe the 27th, 2019, and commit to action right here. And there are a lot of people who can do this and really help. Here, Pat, you're up.
So I think back to 1970 and the teach-in that happened on this campus that we need to recapture and embody the spirit, the sense of urgency that was present at that moment. And since that time, we can't discount the progress that we've made, but with the progress, we've also gained additional clarity. And so I think that now things are as pressing as ever. And we, everyone in this room, collectively with our partners at the university and externally, we just need to sort of renew our commitment and be active.
Great, wonderful. So I want to thank our speakers. You have yours already. And I want to thank everyone who contributed to helping us organize this, our M-LEEaD Center and all the staff, especially Meredith McGee, who's here in the front, for all the hard work. And a lot of the behind-the-scenes work from SEAS and the School of Public Health and the Environmental Health Sciences Department. And I want to invite you to join us for a reception. We've got great partners at the tables, and I look forward to more questions and conversations. So thank you so much. And this will conclude the live stream part of our event. Thank you.
Thank you.